Hello and welcome back to From Alexandria to Tokyo, Art, Colonialism and Entangled Histories. My name is Ming Tiampo and I'm a professor of art history at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. And I'm the co-director of the Center for Transnational Cultural Analysis. I am here as moderator today of the fourth panel against the neo-colonial, the last panel of our conference. And I would like to take a moment to thank all of the organizers from the Tate and Mori, as well as the previous speakers, moderators, and co-conveners for an exciting and extremely stimulating 2 days. For our last panel, we will be focusing on our contemporary moment to further complicate our understandings of national histories and the geobody in multiple sites. Here, contemporary refigurings of history play an important role in thinking about the specters of neocolonialism in the present. From Pamela Corey's paper Andrew Nguyen, Voicing the Silenced Postcolonial Histories of Senegalese Tirailleurs, and Nguyen Trinh Thi's piece on colonized Cham communities in Vietnam, we move on to Anna Bilbao's reflections on Krai Sam Nang's land reclamation in Singapore, built at the expense of Cambodian land and bodies, some of them the same Cham populations described by Corey. We then move on to another paper about extraction and ambivalence, Wenyi Teo's analysis of Fang Di's work about Chinese Belt and Road initiatives in Papua New Guinea and the autonomous region of Bougainville, made while working for one of those same Chinese state-owned corporations. Finally, we will return to the idea of the voice and consider the revisionist potentialities of listening in Fiona Admondson's paper, which considers the works of Su Chao-wei and Koizumi Meiro on Japanese World War II imperialism through Maori filmmaker Barry Barclay's notion of the listening camera. Through these interventions, we are reminded that history is, as Stuart Hall wrote, never closed, but maintains an open horizon toward the future. Our first speaker, Pamela Corey, researches and teaches modern and contemporary art history with a focus on Southeast Asia within broader Asian and global contexts. She is currently a lecturer in the history of art and archaeology at SOAS University in London, and is the author of City in Time, Contemporary Art and Urban Form in Vietnam and Cambodia, which will be forthcoming from the University of Washington Press in 2021. Together with Wenyi Teo, one of our other panelists, our third panelist, she is guest co-editor of Voice as Form, a special issue of Oxford Art Journal, which is coming out in 2020. Pamela's lecture is pre-recorded, and so she unfortunately will not be able to take questions live. Her paper is called From My Mouth Alone, Specters of Communication and the Materialization of Post-Colonial Voices in Vietnam. Please welcome Pamela Corey.
So thank you to Ming for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers of the conference, the organizers at Mori Art Museum and the Tate, for giving me this opportunity to share some work in progress and to flesh out some of these ideas. So my paper is titled From My Mouth Alone, Specters of Communication and the Materialization of Post-Colonial Voices from Vietnam. It could be said that post-coloniality exists in multiple states in contemporary Vietnam. The narrative of resistance to foreign occupation continues to shape the socialist telos of sovereignty and national identity, eliding the complexities of the geobody's construction. These include its formation as a Chinese frontier province from 111 BCE to 939 CE, its territorial partitioning as part of French Indochina, Japanese occupation in World War II, followed by what is domestically referred to as the War of Resistance against America. Yet the more uncomfortable entanglements that challenge this post-colonial narrative's territorial and teleological integrity have been forgotten, neglected, or even suppressed. Such subjects include human legacies found in the African corners of the former French Empire and the duality of Vietnam's post-colonial self, as colonized and as colonizer in the case of the historical annexation of Champa. These are the respective subjects of contemporary moving image works by two artists based in Vietnam. Tuan Andrew Nguyen's 2019 video installation, The Specter of Ancestors Becoming, uses transtemporal dialogues and their ventriloquial enactments to channel the imagination of Vietnamese Senegalese descendants of West African soldiers conscripted to fight for the French in the First Indochina War, and whose Vietnamese wives either stayed in Vietnam or accompanied them back to Senegal. Nguyen Trinh T's 2015 film, Letters from Panduranga, uses the essay film to probe the representational contours of authorship and community among the remaining Cham minority population in Vietnam. The artists use the epistolary form or scripted dialogue as both narrative structure and spectral medium, rendered through vocalization to signify and destabilize the deferrals of letter writing and historical address. Writing and voice bridge time and space to imagine troubled intimacies and affiliations, allegorize the post-colonial subject's relationship to the state, and reflect on the artist's own authorial function. Given the time constraints, I will devote a little more time to Tuan Andrew Nguyen's The Specters of Ancestors Becoming, as I have published on Nguyen Trinh T's Letters from Panduranga elsewhere, and some of that material I will share today. T is a Hanoi-based artist filmmaker and the founder and director of Hanoi Doc Lab, an independent center for experimental and documentary film. A recurring strategy in her work is that of sampling and montage in the service of polyvocality and the troubling of authorship and linearity. The narrative of Vietnamese history is a frequent testing ground for such strategies, as is the case with Letters from Panduranga, which was conceived in 2009 when the Vietnamese government announced plans to construct two nuclear energy plants backed by Russian and Japanese engineering in the central southern province of Ninh Thuận, a project that was ultimately canceled in 2016. Ninh Thuận is the Vietnamese name given to Panduranga, the last sovereign principality of the Kingdom of Champa, which was annexed by the emerging Vietnamese polity of Dai Viet in 1832 after a process of deterritorialization and colonization that had unfolded over 2 centuries. The Cham peoples were culturally, linguistically, and economically disenfranchised, and large populations dispersed further inland and through diasporas in Cambodia and Malaysia. However, today there are still Cham communities in central and southern Vietnam for whom the plans to construct nuclear plants in Ninh Thuận exposes their ongoing marginalization and even their continued condition of erasure. It is this persistent scripting of Champa as the past, as an episode of antiquity and chapter written into the Vietnamese story of multi-ethnic nation building, that inspired T to grapple with the project of depicting a living community while giving visual form to the fraught nature of their historical representation. Narrated in Vietnamese from a script written by the filmmaker, the film unfolds through an epistolary exchange between a man and a woman both undertaking fieldwork or site-based research. The man writes during his journey from north to south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, while the woman writes from her location in the former lands of Panduranga. The north-south positioning appears to spatially allegorize historical expansionism with its dominance of masculine master narratives, while the female speaker situates her location in the south as a place from which to vocalize the self as a gendered, ethnically and nationally inscribed subject, as well as her positionality as a researcher and filmmaker. Disputing the presumed authority of her vision and voice as a Vietnamese filmmaker representing Cham perspectives. For these reasons, she repeatedly questions her place and role through a series of utterances, questioning such interconnected concepts as community, history, landscape, and representation. the essay format as that which enables authorial meditation on the making of images, thus facilitates a series of interstitial disjunctions, which Laura Rascaroli suggests is underscored by T's use of epistolary dialogue. An example of this occurs in what we should understand to be the asynchronous dialogue that occurs in letter writing, but is brought into temporal correspondence through voice and the moving image. The contributions by the letter writers appear as forms of self-address rather than responsive exchange, two sets of vocalized contemplations whose lyrical sympathies belie the fact that they are not always smoothly aligned as communicatory returns. For T, the two semi-fictional letter writers represent dual aspects of her subjectivity as a filmmaker, reflecting upon strategies she used in the past in contention with those to which she is drawn in the present. The push and pull of distance between author and subject, between author and image, between image and subject, is expressed through spaces of visual indeterminacy, corresponding analogies of spatial and temporal liminality, and the gendered textures of dual voices that emulate one another in timbre, tonality, and modulation. Tuan Andrew Nguyen is a Vietnamese-American artist based in Ho Chi Minh City who co-founded the artist collective The Propeller Group and the artist-run space SanArt. Several of Nguyen's works in the first decade of the new millennium questioned the historical and dialectical notions of modernity that continue to resonate within everyday life in contemporary Vietnam. Other works would situate Vietnam as a site of transnational perspectives and self-reflections. Throughout his practice, there is a fascination with the obsolete, the artifactual, and the bridging of distances of time and geographical space in ways that test the boundaries of possibility. As such, letter writing, the scripting of parafictional dialogues, and what I call ventriloquiality, or the quality and characteristics of ventriloquism rather than the literal act, are recurring motifs in his practice. Commissioned for the 2019 Sharjah Biennial, the Specter of Ancestors Becoming is a 4-channel video installation that is meant to surround the viewer on 4 sides, making total spectatorship an impossibility while appearing to yield aural immersion as a form of sensorial and narrative compensation. Structured through a series of vignettes set in Dakar and Saigon, the former name of Ho Chi Minh City, the film features the Vietnamese-Senegalese descendants of what were known as the tirailleurs sénégalais, or Senegalese riflemen, who were often forcibly deployed by the French colonial government to fight in the world wars and in the suppression of colonial uprisings. When the French were defeated by the Vietnamese at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, many Vietnamese wives accompanied their Senegalese husbands to West Africa with their children, fearful of the repercussions for their mixed-race children should they stay in Vietnam. Some soldiers brought their mixed-race children or adopted Vietnamese children to raise in Senegal, while their mothers remained in Vietnam. The film navigates the fragmentary remembrances and the longings to imagine and confront these historical intimacies and familial fractures, and thus enacts a series of fictional scenes collaboratively scripted with first and second generation Vietnamese Senegalese descendants who also provide voiceover and narration for the enactments. The images occupy up to 4 screens at once, often including multiple camera views of the scene and/or clips from archival historical footage. The film begins in a documentary mode with one man's reading aloud a frayed yellowed letter written by his mother in Vietnam to her husband in Senegal. From there, the film's realism becomes more malleable and even evanescent, progressing through the scripted scenes enacted by members of the Vietnamese Senegalese community, alongside simultaneous footage of the men and women providing real-time voiceover. There are 3 such dialogues. One between a Senegalese father and Vietnamese mother set in Saigon in the aftermath of Dien Bien Phu. Another between a Senegalese father and his mixed-race son set in an office in Dakar. And the last between a Vietnamese grandmother in Senegal and her granddaughter in a Dakar courtyard. The scenes are punctuated by one in which a retired general sings a Vietnamese language revolutionary song. Sorry, the slide did not advance. Okay. The third dialogue dissolves the clarity of individual and temporal positions of enunciation, subjectivity, and remembrance as the figures speak for and to each other, across the living and the deceased, across the past, the present, and the future. A musical passage with an original song sung in Wolof by Serigne Osmane Mabake Noreni, whose grandmother was Vietnamese, concludes the film. Like Letters from Panduranga, Specters of Ancestors Becoming addresses historical memory and the disappearance of a minority group's culture and traditions. In 2009, it was estimated that there was a community of some 300 children of Vietnamese Senegalese parentage born between the 1930s and the 1950s. Most of the Vietnamese grandmothers have now passed away. The loss of intergenerational knowledge and the desire on the part of children and grandchildren to inherit these memories shaped Twin Andrew's focus on orality and the crafting of personal memory as both a form of imagination, but also as a means of reconstruction that speaks to another historiographical gap. The story of West African soldiers conscripted to fight for the French is rendered as absence or abstraction in the historical record. Earlier imperial histories that hailed the accomplishments of the colonizers rendered African soldiers as invisible or as Orientalist tropes. After World War II, the rising field of area studies began to accommodate oral testimonies by these veterans, but only if they were aligned to the perceived truth value of archival documentation. It was only in the 1990s that oral history gained wider legitimacy as historical method in the academy, overcoming previous skepticism about the subjective and unreliable nature of memory. Oral history came to be valued as a unique primary source because it could communicate information about the past as well as the outlook of the speakers in their present. Voice thus works literally and metaphorically in the film, in parallel with this validation of oral history as a crucial means of addressing this lacuna in French colonial historiography. As historian Joe Lunn points out, quote, the recounting of the past is no longer a monologue, but instead based on the interplay of multiple voices, end quote. The use of voiceover also invokes ventriloquiality as a means of speaking against constraints, and the film's invocation of multiple forms of deferral signifies the instability of any perceived resolution. Such deferrals are enacted through the multi-channel format of the installation, with the deferral of full spectatorship, the deferral of synchrony between image and voice, as the viewer may need to be physically reoriented in order to perceptually sync the voice with their view of its source, and the deferral made transparent in the deliberate exposure of the act of dubbing. These deferrals invoke the historiographical delays of scholarship and earlier distrust of oral histories because of their temporal removal. If deferral further signifies asynchrony, being out of time or untimely, rather than being in time or timely, it also provides a melancholy allusion to the presence of the Vietnamese Senegalese in their time, as well as in history, as racialized figures, unassimilable to varying degrees in Vietnamese, French, or Senegalese society. There is the sense, too, of these testimonies being out of time, as deferred accounts from interlocutors who are themselves almost out of time to share or obtain the cultural knowledge that later generations may desire. It is thus tempting to see the specters of ancestors becoming as writing these asynchronous figures into national and transnational histories, but it's more complicated than that. The film's focus on transtemporality through the collaborative scripting of the dialogues and the use of voice instead opens a space for imagination and for the very embodiment of memory as historical recreation or recreation. Similarly, Letters from Panduranga uses the epistolary form and the material substance of voice to reflexively ponder authorial positionality and the work of historiographical address, and similarly interweaves orality and archival imagery as a means of storytelling. Each film is thus a materially and affectively dense interweaving of memory, testimony, and fiction, as well as a form of historical accounting. Both films reflexively cohere longing, presence, and the process itself of constructing post-colonial representation and selfhood. Thank you very much.
Anna Bilbao is a lecturer in modern and contemporary art at the University of York. Her research explores extractivism through the lens of visual culture, histories of exhibition making and art institutions, as well as contemporary art from the Global South, mainly from Southeast Asia and Latin America. Prior to joining York, she was an editor of After All Journal and a research fellow at the After All Center at Central St. Martin's. Please join me in welcoming Anna Bilbao.
Hello, okay, so I'll start. Where is my land? Cambodia's question in the wake of Singapore's neo-colonial endeavors. Environmental anthropologist Jerry C. suggests that sand is a substance that enables us to imagine divergent forms of time. He invites us to rethink our relations to materials, not only because they matter, but because they may alter our ways of relating to concepts such as the political. In what follows, I would like us to think through sand together in order to confront two of the most common paths from which we make sense of the future. The idea, and I quote, of a unitary planetary time, like the Anthropocene, and I quote again, the promises of infinite economic development, end quote. Much like the colonial project, these two ideas are rooted in the view that people and territories are or have been extractible. Macarena Gomez Barriz calls this colonial-like viewpoint the extractive zone, referring to how territories, peoples, plants, and animals are perceived as and reorganized as, and I quote here, commodities rendering land as for the taking, while also devalorizing the hidden worlds that form the nexus of human and non-human multiplicity, end quote. Is there another way of making sense of the future when thinking through substances? Can contemporary visual practices tell us something about such hidden worlds? As the second most extracted resource in the world after water, sand exposes how economic development and the safeguarding of human and non-human livelihoods can be radically incompatible. Conversely, and beyond the extractive zone, sand is quintessentially a substance for radical compatibility. It is made of non-human and pre-human residues and holds histories of places and non-places, personal and geological memories yet predating history and memory. This seemingly homogeneous substance has collapsed various time forms into its single material existence, thereby symbolically intercepting our ways of making sense of the past and the future. Now, I will introduce issues brought about by land reclamation in Singapore and sand dredging in Cambodia, discussing how two works by Cambodian artist Vai Sam Nang are able to capture the neo-colonial implications of sand dredging simultaneously from two perspectives. These works offer us a dislocated glimpse into the conflicting narrative of extraction. Instead of representing the sides of the conflict, they invite us to think through sand. I want to propose that they bring about forms and methods of engagement with the world that contain unique ways of embodying temporality beyond imperial notions of time. So, land reclamation in Singapore. Singapore is both the world's largest importer and consumer of sand for the purposes of construction and land reclamation, the process of creating new land. The country started reclaiming land to create spaces for trade in 1822, 3 years after Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, the founder of modern Singapore, established the country as a British colony, part of the East India Company. 200 or 300 workers from China, Malaysia, and India were recruited to work in sand extraction for low payment. Since its independence in 1965, Singapore has tripled its population and increased in its landmass by 25%. Together with industrialization, land reclamation has transformed the city-state's weak economy of the colonized into that of a colonizing Asian tiger, so-called Asian tiger. Arguably, Singapore's economic development, political survival, and the continued prosperity of its inhabitants is, and I quote, predicated on continuing flows of sand and gravel from the neighboring countries, end quote, thereby galvanizing its neo-colonial status. After Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam banned or limited sand exports to Singapore due to its social and environmental toll, Singapore turned to Cambodia, now one of its main suppliers. Despite Cambodia's official ban on coastal sand mining in 2017, exports to Singapore in fact increased. The country was not only purchasing, but stockpiling sand. High levels of corruption in both governments result in mismatched sand trade data. There is continuous illicit activity by governments themselves and other actors, including local and regional entrepreneurs or the military. Much like in the colonial period, sand extraction for construction and land reclamation relies on migrant workers. Currently, around 200,000 are in the country on agent-mediated work permits for construction. Such permits combine low salaries, much of which goes towards exorbitant agent fees, with zero prospects for obtaining citizenship or residency. Abuses and workplace injuries are not properly dealt with, and these workers and their labor are kept out of public view in the city. They are housed in dormitories in industrial areas, where they live and sleep in precarious conditions. As much of Kavai's artistic production, Enjoy My Sand is a network of research and visual experiments that exist in a variety of media. Kavai became aware of sand extraction for the construction and reclamation in Singapore during a research visit in 2013, where he realized that the different sites he was visiting were built with Cambodian sand. Singaporean reclaimed lands are today populated by artificial beaches, high-end malls, and real estate developments inhabited by locals, which generated mixed feelings in the artist, since he could see the locals wholeheartedly enjoying the sand, his sand. This video performance shows the artist engaging in conversations with different people by the beach in Singapore. The artist first draws a sign that reads "Free Cow Taxi from Cambodia." Wearing only a swimming suit, sunglasses, big cattle horns, and a generous smile, Kavai goes around the beach holding the sign offering his taxi services to the bathers. Initially, he's met with skepticism, but eventually, mostly children climb on his back and take the ride. Adults who wouldn't share their food with him or walk beside him along the beach. The landscape shows the Singaporean horizon over the water, populated with industrial boats. The sand, the main character of this work, emerges from the ocean, but then encroaches into grass, creating a strange mix between park and sandy beach. When the sun shines, the soundscape is dominated by blowing wind and rolling waves. As the sun goes down, these calming sounds are replaced by exhilarating laughter. Cow Taxi starts to attract larger groups of people who are eager to engage with him. They take pictures with him, invite him to play volleyball, and some of them even challenge him to carry on his back some of their heaviest members. Eventually, Cow Taxi waves goodbye and runs away from the camera. The playful character of the work conceals the suffering involved in the construction of a space that hosts innocuous recreation. The sand in this work seems to be the only witness of every stage of the suffering, but it performs its significance almost in silence. Although the artist's smile never fades, he puts his lean body at the service of others, reinforcing Gómez Barriz's idea that akin to a colonial-like viewpoint, territories and people are there for the taking. When I raised the paradoxical character of the work with the artist, he brought to my attention yet another witness, which, unlike the sand, is unavailable to us viewers. The pain felt in his back while transporting joyful passengers. Production-wise, the work is as discreet as the artist's back pain, but as such, it also has the potential to instantaneously unravel the collection of aggressive histories and implications outlined above. Sand dredging in Cambodia. Sand dredging takes place in lakes, river estuaries, and shallow seas by extracting sediment from the waterbed. It is consumed for domestic construction or exportation. Although sand dredging can be key to the economic development of the country, deregulation has transformed it into a threat to human and environmental rights. For instance, villagers' fishing equipment has been destroyed by the heavy machinery brought by the companies, thus affecting their right to work. Rampant sand dredging has caused dramatic decrease in fishing. Erosion, pollution, and the deepening of the water has affected fish, crab, and mollusks caught on coasts and rivers. Communities are now unable to farm their land due to the water turbidity caused by extreme suspended sediment, and livestock are unable to drink the water. People started sharing their clean water with the animals, generating a shortage for themselves. They had to buy water for drinking and cooking elsewhere, contributing to strains on their expenditure and thereby affecting the right to water and the right to food. The collapse of mangroves and shorelines wash away crops and jeopardize the homes and lives of entire families near rivers, violating the right to life. Some families have suffered forced displacement. Others have taken almost unpayable bank loans to settle elsewhere. Villagers, NGO representatives, activists, and students have drawn attention to these incidents only to face harassment and intimidation by the companies, and with unlawful detention by the local authorities, who violate the citizens' right of freedom of expression, assembly, and association. Labor conditions are also a concern. As an activity that belongs to the informal economy, workers' rights, including contracts and health and safety in the workplace, are neglected. Where is My Land is an extension of Kavai's long-term research endeavors, an unprecedented collaboration and the development of previous work. The title evokes a reaction from communities who see their sand disappear. In protest, they ask with indignation, "Where is my land?" The government's most common response, and one difficult to argue against, is that the land had disappeared due to climate change. Where is My Land materializes the collaboration between Kavai, working behind the camera at this time, and dancer Nguyen Radi, who performs at the heart of the scene. The video is filmed in 3 different locations near Phnom Penh. Each location represents a different use or consequence of sand dredging, infilling for the purposes of construction, collapsed homes, and the predominance of invasive equipment for dredging. Unlike Enjoy My Sand, this work dispenses with an obvious narrative. Scenes show the dancers' moves reacting to each side. Exaggerated, sudden, and violent gestures draw attention to a distinction between bodies that belong in the landscape and those that don't, the dancer often being on the borderline. Strong movements take place in the very edges of the riverbank or on unstable surfaces over the machinery. The performer's actions express utmost precarity. Nguyen is not always answering to the landscape. He sometimes softly blends with it or disappears as in quicksand. Sand is part of the landscape, but it is not there to merely witness the passage of time. Rather than a discrete bystander, sand, dry or muddy, is activated by Nguyen's provocations. His kicks and punches make it collapse into the river, as happens with the family's houses. His body then dwells against the traces left by the collapsed homes. With an effort, one can hear the sand, even if the sound is overpowered by the dancer's heavy breath, his contact with the water, and the running excavator. The sudden touch of his skin against the mud is loud. Sand finds an expression in this work. Sand communicates again as it's suctioned by the machine. The grain lumps rub themselves against the pipe, producing resonance as Nguyen moves in sync with the equipment. Sand is, however, not doing all the heavy lifting. The choreography is intense. The muscles stretch up to the point of inviting anxiety, and the work itself is demanding. It presents itself to us unhurriedly, challenging us to activate our senses. We lend our ears that battle to bring the sounds of sand to the fore. We lend our imagination to draw a picture of the everyday life of the Cham, a Southeast Asian Muslim community that Pamela talked about in her paper, after listening to festival songs in Arabic at the end of the video. Finally, we lend our sense of smell to the work, almost perceiving the odor of muddy water, plants, and rust. Though children laugh and birds sing, the work delineates a somber space. Suffering and protest are not explicit but perceivable. Dogs bark frightened by the excavators. So to conclude, these two works expose the contradictions embodied by sand extraction and land reclamation simultaneously, without us having to choose between artificial dichotomies. Instead of offering a solid standpoint from which to build empathy or disgust, these works allow us to see our current temporal structures as transversal, especially if we take the multivalent character of the substance as our epistemic undergrid. Kavai's work embody what Heather Davis describes, and I quote her, as the ability to embrace contradictions that do not have to be resolved, end quote, without ceasing to interrogate the source of such contradictions. Davis renders these as valuable devices when trying to rethink our relationship to the world. Both video performances embrace contradictions, each in their own way. Joy is what's obvious in Enjoy My Sand, but it's the back pain suffered by the artist that gestures towards suffering, only palpable to us if we see beyond the seemingly playful character of the work. Where Is My Land activates our senses through formal gestures that incite us to use more than our sight when relating to video. This exercise shows us the possibility of engaging with aspects of our existence through senses that are apparently not required at a given time. Beyond their contents, these works are imbued with forms and methods we can borrow should we believe that our relationship to the world must be recalibrated. Thank you.
Thank you for that stimulating paper, Anna. We will be continuing our conversations about ambivalence and extraction in our third presentation by Nguyen Teo, who will be presenting the paper, The Artist as Interloper, Embedded Ethnography and Artistic Agency in Phang Di's videos from the front lines of the Belt and Road. Nguyen Teo is an art historian and lecturer in modern and contemporary Asian art and visual culture at the Courtauld Institute of Art, University of London. Her research centers on art, geopolitics, labor, technology, digital culture, ecology, and gender in Sinophone cultures. And from 2008 till 2018, she has been focusing on two book projects, one on contemporary Chinese art from 2008 to 2018, and a monograph on the Singapore-born British sculptor and printmaker Kim Lim. Prior to joining the Courtauld, she worked at the Museum of Contemporary Art Shanghai and the Tate Modern, and has continued to be involved in various curatorial projects. Welcome, Nguyen.
Hello, thank you so much, Ming, and thank you to the organizers of this fascinating conference. So I'm going to dive right in. I want to begin with a series of stills from a short video entitled The Magical of Pipes by the mainland Chinese artist Phang Di, filmed in 2019 on Bougainville Island, an autonomous region of Papua New Guinea in the South Pacific. Over a split screen, we hear and see the members of an indigenous tribe dancing and singing to the tympanic rhythms of handcrafted bamboo instruments. At first, there is little to distinguish the scene from a tourism campaign, and yet there is something disconcerting about the juxtaposition between generic long shots of the tribe and close-ups of their individual bodies. At various moments, the frame is dominated by a rippling expanse of flesh, pulsing with physical exertion and beaded with sweat, or by the nimbus of hair on the heads of the female dancers. The camera pushes the racialized, gendered body in pieces to the point of visual abstraction in a way that is unapologetically intrusive and objectifying. mirroring perhaps the historical and ongoing struggles of the Bougainville people, who have actively and at times violently resisted the extractivist incursions of colonial and neo-colonial powers seeking to profit from the region's vast reserves of copper and gold. That a Chinese artist like Fang Di should take the plight of the indigenous population of Bougainville as his subject matter is not as unlikely or novel as it first appears. In a seminal article entitled The Artist as Ethnographer from 1995, the art historian Hal Foster drew attention to what he called a quasi-anthropological tendency in artistic practice since the 1960s. Artists were not only adopting ethnographic approaches and practices in their methods of research and presentation, but also deferring the site of artistic and political transformation to a far removed elsewhere and outside, embodied by the figure of the cultural other, the oppressed postcolonial, subaltern, or subcultural. What begins as a well-meaning artistic allyship or a politics of identification risks tipping over into what the anthropologist Clifford Geertz called ethnographic ventriloquism, speaking for or from the position of the other in the guise of an authentic voice, which can only really be a cultural and even political projection. Foster was writing in a period of accelerated globalization that seemed to negate the possibility of a pure outside in any case, reflected, of course, in the rise of biennials, traveling exhibitions, and site-specific commissions across a rapidly expanding transversal art world, and the increasingly itinerant personal geographies of artists themselves. As Foster surmised, the automatic coding of artists vis-a-vis alterity is especially problematic under these conditions because the projection of politics as other and outside distracts from a politics of here and now. And since this is in part a projection, this outside is not other in any simple sense. In this paper, I want to revisit some of these concerns by focusing on the series of works that Fang Di produced in Papua New Guinea, PNG, and the autonomous region of Bougainville. I argue that these works specifically play on the ambivalence between outside and inside, authenticity and alterity, artistic identification, and political agency, and provide a unique glimpse into shifting migrancies of artistic and actual labor, formed by new constellations and geographies of power. In addition to the aforementioned The Magical of Pipes, Fang also produced an hour-long documentary titled Minister, which focuses on the career of the Australian-born botanist-turned-politician Justin Tshichenko, the only white member of parliament in Papua New Guinea. Fang Di is in the process of completing another documentary project, tentatively titled Youth Dedicated to Bougainville, which centers on a Chinese businessman called David Fang, no relation to the artist, who was officially appointed as a chieftain despite having no familial ties to indigenous tribes. While The Magical of Pipes squarely puts the scopic focus on the indigenous subject, the other two projects center instead on flamboyant and charismatic foreigners who, in spite of their outsider status, have not only succeeded in insinuating themselves into the complex political and social ecologies of another culture, but also risen to occupy democratically elected political positions, so much so that they are expected to actively represent and speak for the local people. Moreover, Tshichenko and David Fang have each acted as intermediaries between their local governments and an increasingly dominant geopolitical interloper in the South Pacific. In 2017, PNG became one of more than 70 countries to officially sign onto the People's Republic of China's Belt and Road Initiative. an expansive Sinocentric global development plan to promote trade and build infrastructural connectivity across vast geographical meridians, spanning roughly 65% of the world's population and a quarter of its GDP. As I will soon focus on in greater detail, Fang's documentaries ostensibly chart the growing impact of Chinese trade, investment, and soft power in the South Pacific Islands in a way that draws attention to past, present, as well as future neocolonial entanglements in the region. But what makes Fang's work especially interesting is the artist's own embeddedness within the very structures and systems of power that he seeks to bring to the field of visual representation. Indeed, Fang was not visiting PNG and Bougainville Island under the aegis of an artistic commission or a residency project. Rather, he had moved to the capital city of Port Moresby in 2017 as part of his day job as an engineer, employed by one of the Chinese state-owned companies tasked with overseeing the construction of a new highway and a $35 million convention center, all financed by the Chinese government. Fang's unique subject position, or what he calls his dual identity, thus further problematizes the automatic coding of artists vis-a-vis alterity. He is both a cultural outsider in the region and a corporate insider of the Belt and Road, a critical observer of its effects and an implicated participant in its abstruse machinations. This ambivalence is compounded by his use of the documentary form itself, a medium that carries the charge of authenticity and objectivity precisely because of its purported critical distance. Yet Fang's intense proximity to the Belt and Road both accentuates and attenuates the work's claims to veracity. On the one hand, Fang's insider position, as one working within or possibly against the system like a mole or an informant, lends his work an air of added critical realism. On the other hand, the artist's complicity with and reliance upon the system also renders his images suspect, uncomfortably reviving historical associations of the documentary form as one that has functioned as an instrument of government and commerce. I would argue that Fang self-consciously plays to these tensions by focusing on ambivalent figures like Tachenko and David Fang, who we might even think of as avatars for the artist himself. Minister begins dramatically with time-lapse sequences of orchids exploding into full bloom to the overtures of rousing classical music. Tachenko first appears riding through the streets of Port Moresby in an open-topped vehicle, waving at the cheering crowds. The film documents how he first migrated from Australia in the 1990s as a horticulturalist specializing in orchids and ended up hosting a wildly popular television program called Happy Gardener, in which he instructed local people on the cultivation of indigenous flora with a great deal of enthusiasm, but very little cultural sensitivity, as we can see from these images. From there, he built a successful business and then made what is sadly an all too familiar leap from being an overblown, politically incorrect TV personality to a democratically elected politician. He became the minister for Moresby South, one of the least developed districts in the city, by an overwhelming majority in 2012, and was tasked with organizing the very first Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, APEC, to be held in PNG in 2018. Over the duration of the piece, we witness how Tachenko negotiates between competing foreign interests in the region, acting as an intermediary between the PNG government and its native Australia, which still maintains a strong political and economic presence in its former colony, whilst actively courting the new player on the scene, China. In both his one-on-one interviews with Fang and in public, Tachenko speaks of and to the people in a tone that is not only paternalistic and trivializing, but also at times threatening and disciplinary. The film culminates in a sequence that shows foreign dignitaries arriving in PNG for the APEC summit, attesting to the success of Tichenko's political maneuverings. Towards the end of the documentary, however, we briefly hear the voice of the artist asking about the ostentatious ring Tichenko is always pictured wearing. The latter explains that the design is based on a tribal mask from the Sepik River region, which he had remade in 18-karat gold and studded with gemstones. The ring, a form appropriated from local customs and worn as a sigil of power and authority, is a stark reminder of the region's natural resources and mineral wealth that has led to economic and extractivist incursions over the last 250 years by a myriad of colonial powers, such as Holland, Germany, Britain, Japan, Australia, and perhaps now China. We are reminded that it was Tichenko's love of orchids that first drew him to PNG, an ornamental flower which bears long associations with colonial botany, global trade, and conquest. Tichenko's appropriation of tribal symbology in the ring, or what might be considered his ethnographic self-fashioning, is a trait that is shared with the other protagonist of Fang's still unfinished piece, Youth Dedicated to Bougainville. In both these videos, the subject of Fang's ethnographic gaze in the works isn't the cultural other in its usual sense, but rather the cultural interloper. Slippery figures like Tichenko and David Fang, who play all sides and ingratiate themselves into shifting networks of power. This parallels Fang Di's own methods, as he had relied on personal and business connections in PNG through his day job to gain access to and befriend these figures. Unlike the protagonists of his film, however, I would argue that Fang Di is more than conscious of his own ambivalent status, and this is iterated most clearly in The Magical of Pipes, the work I began this talk with. We hear the voices of the indigenous tribe and are informed by a brief subtitle that they sing in praise of the land and their hopes for independence, but the words are not translated. The camera zooms in uncomfortably and even intrusively on the bodies of the performers, interpolating the viewer in an Althusserian sense as consumers of the work, which has come to us as an artistic commodity via the transglobal neoliberal circuits of our rapidly expanding art world. To conclude, interloper is a term that stems from the late 16th century Dutch to denote an unauthorized trader trespassing on the rights of a trade monopoly, from inter amidst, and loper from landloper or vagabond. It is one that has its roots in colonial enterprise and connotes an unwelcome guest or an itinerant yet intrusive presence. As the environmental psychologist Cindy Katz has observed in her article titled Vagabond Capitalism, quote, "A vagabond moves from place to place without a fixed home. However, vagabondage insinuates an unsettled, irresponsible, and disreputable life, which can be said of the globalization of capitalist production," end quote. Fang's two seemingly distinct spheres of labor overlap in the Belt and Road Initiative, and there is still much to be said about how the work is undergirded by this global infrastructural project, thinking of infrastructure as a form of extra statecraft, or in terms of what Sandro Mazadra and Brett Nielsen call a politics of operations, how capital might be understood as a direct political agent fueled by the operations of transnational finance and logistics. But what Fang's videos do, as I have sought to draw out in this paper, is present a more complex and imbricated picture of competing neocolonial interests, political maneuverings, and social relations in the South Pacific in a way that generates friction. What Anna Singh, in her well-known work, Friction and an Ethnography of Global Connection, called, I quote, "the sticky materiality of practical encounters, where the rubber meets the road." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that paper, Winnie. It was very exciting to be able to see the images that I've been reading about in your manuscript. I was really struck by the visual modalities of those videos, and I'd love to be able to speak with you and the rest of the group a little bit more during the question and answer period. In the meantime, let's go to our last paper, Fiona Admondson's Opening Our Ears, Listening to Japanese World War II Imperialist Histories Through Contemporary Filmic Artworks. Fiona Admondson is an artist and writer who has exhibited widely throughout the Asia-Pacific region, the United States, and Europe. She is senior lecturer at the School of Art and Design University and recently completed her PhD at Monash University, which explored alternative modalities for memorializing stories and experiences associated with the Asia-Pacific War. The exhibition that resulted from this research, A Body That Lives, has been nominated for the 2020 Walters Prize, Aotearoa's most prestigious art award. Please join me in welcoming Fiona Admondson.
Here. So to start, this year marks the 75th anniversary of Japan's surrender to American Allied forces, which brought the Asia-Pacific War of World War II to an official end. There are many government-sanctioned memorials to this conflict. Predominantly, these memorials focus on collective, national, and regional historical narratives, as well as ideologies of loss, sacrifice, and endurance. Although this memorial infrastructure has an important role in acknowledging and narrating the traumas associated with this conflict, I focus on other forms of memorializing. I explore how the role of listening within contemporary filmic practice can function as an alternative modality for memorializing stories and experiences associated with Japanese imperialist World War II histories. Specifically, I am interested in how filmic imagery can form a kind of visual listening and ethical witnessing of this past as it informs the present. Referencing the artwork of Taiwanese artist Su Chao-wei and Japanese artist Koizumi Mero, I argue that listening to images can disrupt sanctioned official stories and government remembering of this history, thereby creating space for counter, anti-colonial or anti-imperial narratives to emerge. Ethics and social responsibility are important aspects of the thinking that underpins my approach. Accordingly, I would like to start by acknowledging who I am in relationship to this history and why I am drawn to understanding its contemporary presence. My own experience of this conflict is informed from my position of coming from a colonized country, Aotearoa, New Zealand. As a young person, I was taught a very Anglo-European American version of World War II histories, in which racism and imperial expansion were only the work of Japanese forces. I am also influenced by my personal connection to Japan, which comes through a family I have known over the last 15 years. Listening to their stories has prompted me to reflect on my own ethical responsibilities regarding histories of my ancestors' colonization of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I conceive of history as alive, plural, and evolving, something with which to be in relationship. I am interested in how to ethically encounter this history now, where we learn to listen to an expanding repertoire of voices from the past, tell and retell the stories that we have heard, and so define and redefine our position in the present. Part of this process involves relearning and reimagining history, which means attending to how we are implicated in the wrongs of the past, accessories after the fact, but we are also implicated in the past in a wider sense. We live enmeshed in structures, institutions, and webs of ideas which are the product of history, formed by acts of imagination, courage, generosity, greed, and brutality performed by previous generations. Central to this conception of ethically encountering history is the work of embodied listening. I take the position that there is much to be gained from listening and staying connected, even when the images present histories in ways that may look and seem unfamiliar. I align with theorist Kelly Oliver's proposition that there is an ethical responsibility to go beyond comprehension, which equates as much to looking as it does to listening. This framing of ethics is particularly significant when linked to historiography. I am concerned with how to highlight the ongoing presence of Asia-Pacific war histories. Obviously, the conflict itself is long over. However, the imperial, colonial, and racist ideologies that framed it from both Allied and Axis forces remain present. Theorist Avery Gordon explores how unresolved histories of social violence, oppression, abuse, and colonization manifest and are experienced in the present. She refers to this leaking of a past into the present as haunting, which is a constituent element of modern social life. To study social life, one must confront the ghostly aspects of it. This idea translates to the practices of ethical encountering and historical responsibility. Gordon suggests that an alternative diagnostics is required, one that links the politics of accounting in all its intricate political, economic, institutional, and affective dimensions to a potent imagination of what has been done and what is to be done otherwise. It is this potency of imagination that provides a potential means to memorialize stories and experiences of this history in modalities other than state-sanctioned memorials. I suggest that a camera can be used to promote forms of historical and ethical responsibility, which embrace the complexity of who and what is being remembered. I would like to turn to the significance of listening, in particular how a camera, a device designed for seeing, may be used to better enable listening. This idea of the listening camera is based on Indigenous filmmaker Barry Barclay's statement. I believe we might do well to further explore how to make the camera a listener. As a Māori, you are taught how to listen. You sit at the feet and open your ears. You have no right to know. The knowledge is gifted to you at appropriate times and appropriate places. Barclay explored how Māori ways of being could become strategies within filmmaking. I too am interested in how a camera can visually listen and enact new and different forms of witnessing, as well as connecting to seemingly known histories, experiences, and memories. In Sue and Koizumi's artworks, acts of careful, deep listening structure how to encounter and be present to the ongoing legacies of Japanese imperialist World War II histories. Multiple forms of listening are present within Koizumi's work. As viewers, we are invited into listening relationships with the people who speak their experiences, the off-camera prompts from Koizumi and his filming crew, as well as the camera itself with its specific framings. Of note is his 2-channel video, When Her Prayer is Heard. Like much of Koizumi's work, this video explores Japanese World War II histories from perspectives of national identity, public memory, and personal narrative expression. This artwork is situated around Mrs. Kazuko Nagura's experience of losing her boyfriend, Mr. Ken Ohashi, to a failed kamikaze mission. The work starts as a single projected image of an interview where Mrs. Nagura narrates how Mr. Ohashi was summoned to fly a kamikaze mission, and how years later she discovered that his name was not included in those honoured for this act of sacrifice. The imagery then changes to a studio setting double projection. The left channel contains Mrs. Nagura as herself, while the right channel is the same woman dressed with a flying hat and goggles, plus the white scarf that is synonymous with kamikaze pilots. She is playing the role of Mr. Ohashi. A voice from outside the camera frame asks, "Could you please hold a photo and talk to Mr. Ohashi in heaven for the next 3 minutes?" Mrs. Nagura, on the left channel, nods in agreement and signals out of the camera frame for someone to bring her a photograph of Mr. Ohashi. Only the left channel moves while the right is frozen. As she speaks, the same off-camera voice interrupts, with the left channel freezing and the right, Mrs. Nogura playing Mr. Oashi, coming to life. The voice instructs her to respond when she hears the name Ken and to reply, "I am here, Kazuko." Mrs. Nogura is being asked to imagine what she would say to Mr. Oashi if he were still alive. Throughout the artwork, the same off-camera voice interrupts and prompts the timing of Mrs. Nogura as herself and as Mr. Oashi as she reflects on his kamikaze mission and how it felt to receive orders to die. This off-camera instructing voice has a twofold function. Firstly, through repetition and disjunction, it attunes viewers to the small nuances of listening, hesitating, and responding that occur for Mrs. Nogura as she narrates her experiences to an imagined Mr. Oashi. Her narratives are in direct contrast to popular media images of heroism, sacrifice, and the moral enigma ascribed to kamikaze pilots. Secondly, revealing how the artwork was made serves as a reminder that images and documents of history, in this case, Japanese wartime national identity and the heroic figure of the kamikaze pilot, are constructed. Koizumi's use of off-camera audio also functions to provide a way of accessing that which defies material presence, meaning how to connect with the ways history could have been, how to connect with the way histories could have been done otherwise. Acts of listening camera, signaled by the presence of Koizumi's non-imaged voice and Mrs. Nogura's imaged voice, move audiences to take on an ethics of spectatorship and witness the nuances of what is being said, along with the ways history's narration is situated through multiple subjectivities. Here, the camera, with its attuned listening, facilitates connections to this history that move beyond established narratives and processes of remembering and memorializing. Su Chao-wei similarly uses a camera to re-examine the representation of historical narratives and events. In his predominantly video artworks, Su explores the legacies of Japanese colonial occupation of Taiwan and the preceding Cold War years involving the Chinese government. He often focuses on obscure historical narratives and events, as evident in the 2017 exhibition and book, Industrial Research Institute of Taiwan Governor General's Office. The exhibition title refers to an industrial research institute and factory that was established by the Japanese imperial government in Hsinchu, Taiwan. The institute's primary goal was to industrialize the production of military supplies, specifically aviation fuel. The Allied Air Forces of America and Nationalist China heavily bombed Hsinchu during the later years of the Asia-Pacific War, leaving the factory in ruins. After the Chinese nationalist government took over Taiwan from Japan, this part of history was eliminated from the government's version. In his video, Drones, Frosted Bats, and the Testimony of the Deceased, Su combines archival and contemporary footage with letters, read as non-imaged voiceovers, from former Japanese employees of the Industrial Research Institute. This work was produced amongst the factory ruins of the Industrial Research Institute. He adopts 3 flying-related concepts to reflect the role of the plant. These include drones that film the remnants of the factory, as well as the bats that migrate from Japan every year to give birth inside the factory's chimneys, and archival footage of planes flying in formation to bomb Hsinchu. Rather than using only the drone's footage, he also filmed the drone itself. The drone's hovering body, spinning rotors, and moonlight landing gear connect to the bat's body shape. In turn, the bat's bodies, when filmed from underneath as they swarm above the chimneys, establish associations with the archival footage of planes, which are also filmed from the ground. This use of diverse imagery and voiceover illustrate the idea that history is fragmented and ultimately subjective. The drones, bats, and bomber planes do not function as pieces of a larger historical narrative which needs deciphering, but rather function like residues of what was tossed aside without becoming part of history. Su coaxes fragmented historical residues of colonization and warfare into contemporary life through his use of drones and the Japanese migrating bats that are not indigenous to Taiwan. He links these residues to the present, and it is further complicated by the voiceovers which are read by Japanese actors from the memoirs of 19 former workers who are now deceased. These methods frame the conception of history, along with its memorialization, as random, while simultaneously challenging this position through personalized testimonies that conjure up history linked to an exact place. Rather than simply complicating the contemporary presence of historical narratives, which were in this case suppressed by the Chinese nationalist government, he visually connects past events with a specific location and expands processes of remembering beyond what is visible and knowable. His lens-based imagery is premised in suggestion and imagination, which enables viewers to make associations between present-day geographies, personal experiences, and past historical events. Central to this imagery are acts of careful, deep listening. Su and Koizumi employ a camera to see and hear the presence of Japanese imperialist histories and modalities other than government-sanctioned public memorials and museums. Rather than being located in shrines or official memorial gardens, memorializing resides in the body, the voice, the off-camera prompts, and the architecture indexed by the camera. Listening is a key strategy in developing these alternative forms of memorializing. These artworks establish a type of visual listening which prompts viewers to hear histories anew from a present-day position. This listening invites viewers into a relational ethical connection with the complexity of who and what is being remembered, negotiated, and renegotiated. This invitation pivots around practicing other forms of knowing, where the legacies of this history live on in contemporary life, in bodies, voices, and places. It is through this process of deep listening that counter readings of known histories can emerge, thereby creating space for the presence of anti-colonial narratives. These counter histories are premised in making a contact that changes you and refashions the social relations in which you are located. It is about putting life back in where only a vague memory or a bare trace was visible to those who bothered to look. In Su and Koizumi's artworks, the camera asks us to take the time to look as well as listen. There is a social obligation to perform such acts. We are invited to see, hear, and be with histories anew. We are invited to ethically and politically connect with the contemporary presence of the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that beautiful paper, Fiona, especially given that it's 1:30 a.m. for you. Quite punishing, and thank you for your commitment to this panel. Are we now in a discussion format? We're now going to be going, there we go, excellent. We'll now be coming to the question and answer period of this panel. Please be sure to put your questions in the chat function of YouTube, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. I'd just like to remark that I feel like there's a real sort of entanglement between the previous panel and our panel, in the sense that it's almost as if I feel like there's the wind that was blowing through Hotu Nguyen's Hotel Aporia is now blowing through our panel too, bringing through all of these haunted histories into the present. And I'd like to think a little bit together about what it means for those hauntings to be brought to the fore, and what it means for us to be thinking relationally about those kinds of histories. How do we bring out those hidden histories? In particular, I'd like to think about modalities of voice, vocality, ventriloquism, and listening, which is something that comes to the fore in all of your papers. They feature prominently as strategies for rewriting histories and materializing these new relationalities in your papers. Which of course ties back to the previous panel in terms of their different kinds of modalities of writing and generating histories. versus the kind of state-sanctioned memorials that we saw, for example, in Orawara Nodoka's paper that she was discussing. So could you please address the role of voice, vocality, ventriloquism, and or listening in your papers, thinking through how voice and listening presents new potential histories? Who would like to go first, or should I read out Pamela's answer? Okay, I think I will read out Pamela's answer. And I'd also like to point out that we will be going until 12:45 UK time, which will allow us about 20 minutes for discussion. Pamela wrote in response, voice in both the metaphorical and material sense is a key to situating the two works I discuss in dialogue with another. As a mere material substance that is both embodied and disembodied, it gives expression to the forms of intersubjectivity that I think are key to both films. For Nguyen, the use of voiceover and the duality of gendered voices gives form to her self-reflexivity as an author and the contentions of the filmic representation of historically marginalized communities. For Tuan Andrew Nguyen, the work of collaborative scripting and the deliberate exposure of dubbing enacts ventriloquism as a highly personal and affective means of bringing memory into presence as form of embodied historical reconstruction. Do any of you have responses? Comments from your own papers? Anna?
Yeah, I would like to address, I think, the role of listening in the two works I discussed, or maybe just in one, maybe in Where Is My Land? Although we accessed it through a screen, and I think this resonates quite a lot with what Fiona discussed in her paper. So although we access the work through a screen, which kind of assumes sight as the most prominent sense when engaging with this work, I think it's ultimately highly sensorial beyond sight. Now, to me, the subtle sounds of the skin of the artist touching the mud, his heavy breath, the sounds of the dogs barking or of the machinery communicate as much as the visual components. In fact, I think the sonic elements open up or even activate our sense of smell, or at least they trigger our imagination by allowing us to sort of contemplate the smell of the muddy water, the dying fish, the plants, or the rust, if this makes sense. So sound and smell kind of unravel a new layer of engagement with the work, almost granting us access to the complex, all of the complex histories that it embodies.
Thank you. Winnie?
Mute. Oh, right. Hi. No, I think that's a really good question. I listening is a really key part, I think, of the discourse of vocality and sound, and plays a really important role in thinking about subjectivity. My paper, I suppose, it would chime with the notion of ventriloquism that Pamela put forward. Particularly, I was trying to think through Geertz's idea of ethnographic ventriloquism, and which the kind of concept of ventriloquism as a voice that is thrown out, that seems to be rooted in that, where it kind of confuses the identities of speaking subjects, and creates a kind of tension between cross subject positions. At least that's how it's conceived of by, for instance, Stephen Connor. But I think in the video, what's interesting as well is that Fang Di does play with voice and vocality. He the kind of administer, the soundtrack is almost entirely dominated by Tachenko's sort of kind of very kind of forceful narrative. And I showed one image of where he's on a stage, kind of garlanded with flowers, speaking to a local person. And that's the only moment in the film when you hear the voice of a local person from Papua New Guinea. And it is a voice in opposition to him, actually. And he quickly silences that person whilst claiming to kind of speak for them and represent them. So, the idea of, the notion of voice, I think, can be pushed forward in this particular context really bring to bear on the power dynamics at play.
Thank you, Winnie. Fiona?
I think I'm very interested in how acts of listening can be attuned to also acts of seeing. And so how listening it can actually make seeing stronger and more relational and connected. And I think it operates quite differently in Sue's work and Koizumi's work. With Koizumi, you have this complete construction of the image, which is unfolding as you yourself are watching the work. And that's happening through the off-camera audio prompts, which are fairly relentless throughout the work. There's a constant kind of constructing and structuring the image, but also the narrative that is being spoken both between the two roles that she is playing, both herself and Mr. Ohashi. I think in Sue's work, listening functions very, very differently in the sense that the voice, which is both non-imaged and essentially functions as voiceover, attunes viewers to what it is they're looking at in the sense of these three quite almost seemingly disparate sets of imagery brought together. And one of the things I should have mentioned is that we also hear the sound of the drone whilst the drone is also being filmed itself. And that's edited together with the kind of squeaking sounds of the bats. So I guess for me, listening it's an attuning device to seeing.
Absolutely. I think it might make sense for us to follow this up with a question that we got from our audience, from Yokoyama Taichi. They ask, compared to the last 3 sessions, this session seems to have a trend for filmed oral histories as subjects. This being said, all speakers had somewhat differing views on why such a method was used. After the session, do speakers believe that this is a coincidence, small sample size, or do they think there are advantages or underlying causes for such methods being chosen by artists? So perhaps we can go back to Anna.
I don't know. I would have thought that I think it's a small sample and it's partly a coincidence, but also maybe partly. I guess we're all interested in the potential of the medium in a way, in terms of unraveling other types of stories, like beyond material or beyond imperial notions of time and imperial notions of history. And I think film, I guess for all of us, it must be a coincidence, but I guess all of us coincide in the sense that it's an adequate medium, or that the medium lends itself a lot to be able to scratch in terms of these histories. I don't know what the others think, but maybe coincidence.
I think that's a really great question, and I think in the case of our panel, it's been a very happy coincidence. But there's been quite a lot of theorization, I think, written about the role of voice and how it pertains to kind of mediatized forms of representation, in a way that kind of accentuates the voices, the ghostly properties of the voice itself. Michel Chion, for instance, in The Voice in Cinema, writes very eloquently about its utility and its kind of potential to throw the viewer in a way, because when you hear a subject speaking, there's a kind of presumed authenticity, right, to the idea of the speaking subject. Of all the sounds in the world, it's only the voice that really carries that kind of charge of identity and identity politics, therefore. So and I think that's been a theme that's run through all the papers in this panel, certainly.
Absolutely. Maybe before I get to Fiona, I'd like to layer on 2 additional questions that we got from the audience that are very pertinent to this. From Devika Singh, the majority of works discussed in the panel are video-based. Is there, in your view, a particular connection between film and narration and the uncovering of neocolonial legacies? And then from Falchi, So many extremely interesting and inspiring talks today. There's an undeniably documentary quality to all of the works presented by the speakers. I wonder if they could elaborate on the relationship art has established with reality through the use of imagination and fantasy. And Anna and Wenny, if you would like to add to your previous answers after Fiona is done, please feel free to do so.
They're all brilliant questions and quite complex for 1:40 in the morning for me. So I'll do my best to try and answer them. I mean, first and foremost, you know, my practice is as an artist, and I work with the lens-based documentary in particular. And so I'm kind of going to answer all three questions in a non-linear way. In relationship to documentary, I think there's a lot of recent theorizing and re-theorizing around documentary. In particular, I'm thinking of Erica Balsam's beautiful piece, The Reality-Based Community, and you know, really how the documentary form, the documentary modality, can be shifted and changed to sort of enhance its observational qualities. And of course, its observational qualities, you know, come from a context of colonization and imperialism. And, you know, Balsam writes about how the observational lens can be repositioned to create a more caring and connected relationship to reality. And part of that is the voice. And I guess when we're using or looking at complex histories, complex imperialist histories, and how they remain present, the lens with its signifying, you know, observational, you know, its accuracy is a really interesting way in which to work with the unknown, to be able to reimagine what we think we already know. Thank you.
Thank you. Wenny?
Yeah, thank you for these two really interesting questions. I think I might have answered contributed a little bit to Devika's question earlier with my response, but I would love to pick up on what Fiona was saying about the documentary medium, if I may. You know, I think that in the case specifically about Fang Di's piece, you know, there's a long history, well, there's a very rich history of documentary films in China, as well as kind of a longer trajectory of reportage literature, 报告文学, you know, and I'm very interested in connecting Fang Di's practice to that. A lot of it is, you know, that those works also tend to focus on within China itself. So it's very interesting that Fang Di is in a way, you know, embodying this kind of, you know, the migrancies of labor in his dual identity as both artist and producer of images, as well as, you know, kind of worker of the system. So I mentioned in my talk this idea of critical realism, which obviously, you know, which stems from Alan Sekula. And I think some interesting comparisons might be made to, you know, a project like Fish Story, you know, which looks at kind of global movement and circulation and trade and so on in the 1990s, around the time Foster was writing as well. And then thinking about that in relation to the Belt and Road would be quite interesting. And my final point would be that, you know, I think that what I like about Fang Di's work is that a lot of these, you know, documentaries that kind of survey a geopolitical landscape and capital and its effects usually take quite an ethical position, you know, kind of almost a humanist position, and which I think Fang Di's works do as well, but obviously his position is a bit more compromised and a bit more complicated than someone like Ursula Beeman, you know. So I think his work allows us to rethink some of the you know, the complexities of documentary as a medium and migrant images and that kind of thing.
Thank you, Wenny. I think it is important for us to take this discussion towards the main questions of this panel, which is the question of the neocolonial. And the title of this panel is Against the Neocolonial, which assumes that it is actually possible for artists and art historians who are deeply imbricated in an ecology of neocolonial structures to take a position that is against the neocolonial without any forms of ambivalence. How do the artists that you imagine and that you examine navigate these difficult waters, and how do you? I can start with Pamela's answer, and then perhaps we can go counterclockwise to Fiona next, okay? So Pamela's answer is, another way of looking at the notion of against is not necessarily anti, but also speaks to context, as in working against a context, landscape or setting, which signifies immanence and hence the specific ambivalences evoked and articulated by some of the artists discussed in this panel. In Letters from Panduranga, this ambivalence is certainly a central preoccupation for the artist and is addressed through letters. So we can go first to Fiona and then maybe to Anna, because I skipped her just now, and then to Nguyen.
I guess with the two artists that I have looked at, there is definitely an against in the sense of an uncovering of a supposedly obscured or unknown or not popularized narrative. But that uncovering doesn't lead to a knowing. And that's what I'm particularly interested in the sense of how does a lens, you know, which is, as we've just talked about, with its long history, its relationship to documentary, how does a lens hold something that is unknowable, and then how does an audience become present to that? How do we stay with what's unknown, yet reside in it? And I'm really interested in that complexity.
Thank you, Fiona. Anna?
Yeah, I think that maybe as Andra Fraser has said about institutional critique, it is difficult to account for a movement between an inside and outside, or an anti or of the institution, because its structures have been so profoundly internalized. So for example, she says that there is no outside and that we are the institution. In this case, we as art historians. However, even when acknowledging this didn't mean really having to stop taking a critical position in relation to it, I guess. So I think this could be like applicable here. And in fact, I think that what I like Sam Nang's work is precisely this ambivalence, an ambivalence that he embraces, especially through the first work, Enjoy My Sand. But instead of diminishing what he's denouncing, the work that embodies embodies contradiction and tension, and invites us kind of to test or to try out different critical narratives by means of pushing us to rethink our relationships with both materials or substances. Yeah.
Thank you. Nguyen? Final word.
Yeah, I don't think I could have said it better than Fiona and Anna, really. And I feel like my paper, you know, kind of, you know, touches on this question of ambivalence, and, you know, with this kind of arch example of an artist whose subject position is one that straddles, you know, kind of both worlds in a way. I think an interesting thing about that, his work in Papua New Guinea and Bougainville especially, is that what he does is not simply suggest that, oh, you know, China is a new neocolonial power, it's coming to get you and it's going to be horrible and change the world. You know, the videos also expose these layers of colonial and neo-colonial entanglements between competing, you know, players, as it were, on the scene. And so, you know, the artist could not be said to be kind of against neo-colonialism, but draws attention, I suppose, to the complex systems and structures that underlie it.
Right, and also the complicities that we are all involved in, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this very stimulating conversation, for your wonderful papers, and to everyone for bearing with us through our technical difficulties. I would like to thank you all for your time in joining us from all over the world. And now I think it's time for a few closing remarks by Michio Hayashi. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you all still attending this streaming for your continuing interest. Whether you attended all the 4 panels for 2 days or just 1 or 2 panels today, it must have been a frustrating experience to sit through all those presentations and discussions on your monitor, not to mention some technical difficulties we had today. So I am really grateful for your patience. Doing the event online, however, as you must have noticed by now, has remarkable merits too. It made possible for audiences and speakers from widely different locations to participate in the event and provided a platform for meaningful exchanges across the globe. I think we're just starting to discover the possibilities of developing this platform into new stages of virtual cultural dialogues. For 2 days, we travel through a wide variety of spatio-temporal locations and in-between spaces where various cultural forces collide with each other. Of course, I don't have a word to summarize the whole event, but one thing for sure is that I confirm the fact that I don't know so much about art history or history at large, even within a limited time frame of the 20th century. It is frightening to acknowledge this vast field of non-knowledge. I guess many of you who attended this event had a similar impression. Each speaker really opened our eyes to the field where we have not even thought about exploring. To review briefly in passing the presentations from yesterday, the heterogeneous cultural activities in Shanghai in the pre-war period, or the Japanese, Indian, and Western cultural exchanges around the axis of politicized category of craft, or Tagore's ambivalent role in bridging India and Sri Lanka with his universalist modernist ideology while emphasizing the national heritage, or Taiwanese post-war art and its layered cultural references encompassing colonial past, American influence under Cold War, and indigenous tradition, or the dense cultural ideological dialogue between Egypt and Soviet Union that defined the fate of figurative art during the Cold War, or the performative role that linguistic Russification played in the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. All of those topics that were discussed in yesterday's panels really awakened my sensor toward such an intriguing set of unexplored directions. I hope they did the same to each of you. Today's presentations too, since many of you have attended today's 2 panels, I am not going to summarize the presentations here, but each one of them pricked up my ears or opened my ears to unheard voices, even within the domestic context of Japanese art history. Perhaps, like public sculpture, whose semantic instability is part of its existence, history too needs to be imagined to be a construction within the public sphere, whose semantic validity continues to be tested by contingent discoveries, ideological influences, technical conditions, and as such, open to the possibility of endless process of rewriting. But this process of rewriting, as today's presentations eloquently described, often foregrounds entangled relations of power or haunting presence of the voices from the past and demands you to take a position or sometimes internally conflicting positions. In that sense, history writing can be reimagined to be a poiesis in the sense of mutual formation and transformation of a writing subject and his environment consisting of various kinds of historical materials and data. Among various lessons to be learned from this 2-day event, this is for me one of the fundamental ones. In any case, putting my personal impressions aside, this 2-day event was full of revelatory moments of new factual discoveries and theoretical reflections, so that each of you, I am certain, can take back to your own place and start new conversations. For that, I have to mention that the organizing team of Mori and Tate is going to edit the whole event and it makes it available for your revisit. I would strongly encourage you to do so to integrate our already layered voices into your own rewritings. I would like to thank again for all the speakers who gave such wonderful papers and insightful remarks during the discussions. I would also like to thank the simultaneous interpreters who worked very hard to maintain both English and Japanese channels of this streaming alive and smooth. Thank you so much. My many thanks also go to all the technical staff of Mori as well as Tate to make this event possible in the first place, and maintain the smooth operation of it. My big thanks also go to, of course, Mami Kataoka at Mori Art Museum and Soo-kyung Lee at Hyundai Tate Research Center, who led the whole team of this event hand in hand through meandering path under the corona pandemic. Without your joint effort, this would not have been possible. So thank you so much. And finally, I would like to thank all the listeners again who are still out there and watching this streaming. Thank you so much and see you soon somewhere, hopefully between Alexandria and Tokyo. Goodbye. Thank you.